Thank you for taking the time, Greg, and welcome to the mysteries and the secrets behind therapy. Maybe we could just start with what brought you into the therapy career and your 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 experience in this world.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here. What brought me into therapy? I think there's so many different answers to that. I suspect most therapists have three or four different stories they could tell. One story I could tell is that I was a psychology undergrad and my program wasn't clinical, it was academic, experimental. And I was always curious, like, what do those sort of clinical people do? Like, how does somebody be a therapist? How does somebody know more than anybody else and help? So I was always just curious about it. And eventually, through focusing, because I learned focusing first, through focusing, I became more and more curious about therapy. And at first, it seemed like a forbidden kind of world. It was a very secret world. But I could also say it was something about who I am as a person. That even as a young boy, I was very interested in other people's minds, other people's thinking, what made a person different from me, how to convince somebody to agree with me, all sorts of things to do with psychology. And I suspect aspects of my upbringing, the way parents related to me, kind of a sensitivity that I got from them, as well as an oversensitivity, maybe, that I also got from them. So I suspect there's many different ways of answering that question, and I'm not totally convinced by any of them.
Yeah, it's a mystery of all the different strands that landed you here. One of the things that we've been asking folks is how would you define, like, what is mental health to you?
I don't use the term, and I don't like the term. It's become very commonplace. I think too commonplace. I don't know if it really means anything anymore. Partly it comes from assumptions about one's psychology that are similar to assumptions about the physical body. And I don't think that the medical model necessarily fits how we are psychologically. In the body, you can tell usually what an organ is supposed to do and when it isn't doing that. But you can't as easily say what a person's psychology is supposed to do and when it is or isn't achieving that. Some things that seem like very maladaptive ways of living can be the best that a person could come up with given their circumstances. So I think the term mental health can lead us into having assumptions that aren't helpful, that are far too limiting, and yeah, assumptions of pathology, assumptions of self-care that are sometimes somewhat superficial. But I think what mental health is meant to point to is a more holistic idea of what a person is, and that a person isn't just their family or their job or their physical body. A person is also this psycho-spiritual social being, and all of those other realms need to be attended to and are important. I think we live in a system that doesn't tend to value those aspects of a person as much. In that way, I think the contemporary talk about mental health is probably a big step forward. I just wish it was a slightly different term.
Yeah, it feels like the medical pathological model isn't encapsulative enough of the whole psycho emotional, social, spiritual components of a person, which a
Exactly.
therapist works with. So, when you're working with your clients, how do you know when it's something so large you're working with that you're making progress, and how can you tell it's effective?
I don't always know. The client hopefully knows, and they may or may not tell me. The therapy that I offer usually is open-ended and tends to be fairly long-term, although I've had some people that have been shorter term. They wanted something quite discreet and they got that and left. And I think that's fine. That form of therapy is also fine. But how do I get the sense that something positive is happening? I think when the person's life starts to change, if they're able to talk about things they couldn't talk about before, they can get up in the morning and feel different. There has to be some evidence that their life is changing. Sometimes I ask clients, does your partner think you're changing? Because that gives an interesting perspective, especially if the person is so engaged in their own process that they need the opportunity to step back a bit and see themselves within their whole context. And sometimes by doing that, by getting other people's perspective, they start to realize, oh, yes, you're right. That is different. So I think that change in therapy is a very concrete thing. You feel different, you act different, you think differently about things, you see the future differently. Often your whole past changes, which is remarkable.
Yeah, so it seems like your whole ecosystem can be a reflection of your change, your interaction with your ecosystem.
Yeah, exactly. And as the person's present changes, it's interesting that how they see the past changes.
And when you're working with folks, is it mostly focus on present or like how much of it is the present versus the past?
For me, because I work in a focusing oriented way or an experiential way, I always want to work with the present experiencing. So if someone is talking about the past, I hope that they will talk about it enough that their body starts to create the past again. So they can actually feel it inside. They feel what it was like to be in that schoolroom, or they feel what it was like to be with that partner. As soon as they have the feeling, that's in the present.
Mm,
And working in the present with a recreation of the past,
yeah,
which is very different than just working with the thoughts about the past.
yeah. And how much, maybe that's not even a divide, but it's almost like a question of the thought and the body has to go together in order for it to work. But if you purely work on the level of thought, is it effective? Or if you purely work on the level of the body, is it effective?
That's an interesting question. I would say if you are working purely cognitively, it can be effective. You have to look to see if it was effective. It's like you can reframe a situation. If that reframing actually has a bodily impact, then there's an experiential change, and that can be very, very helpful. But not any reframing will do. You have to look for the one that actually has that impact. So working purely with thoughts by accident, sometimes profound change can occur, but often it doesn't. And that distinction is a sort of thing we would look for in a focusing oriented way of working. Just with the body, that's a different question, I would say. If you're working just experientially in some other way, then sometimes the big experiences that can happen working experientially need somehow to be integrated in the client's way of understanding themselves somehow.
Mm,
Working in a focusing way, it is so close to the person's phenomenology, the person's own being, that there are times that a person can have profound change and afterwards not be able to put it into language at all. Sometimes they walk out of the room, they're a changed person, and even their first interaction after the session, they know that something is different, but they don't know exactly what it was. So sometimes I think the body can provide deep change that doesn't always come with symbols. It usually does, but not always. I mean, I remember working with a client who was a very self-contained young man, and during a session, he burst into tears through focusing. He stayed quietly with the feeling in his body for a long time and just burst into tears. And he just said, I have no idea what that was about.
mhm,
He said, but it's the first time I've ever allowed myself to cry in front of another person or in front of myself, which I thought was a very profound way to say it. He knew something deep had changed in his relationship with himself, but he
mhm,
couldn't put it into thoughts or language.
mhm. Yeah, I love what you're saying. It feels like on the mental level, it's possible to have the change, but it needs to have the thread and the experiential, which is in the body. And then for the body based, even if a huge transformation did occur, we're still operating most of us through the world in a cognitive way. So we need to kind of sync up in our framing of the world, and our understanding still. So it's quite the body-mind connection needs to occur simultaneously.
Yeah, and I think it also raises the question of what is a body, because I suspect what the body is processing its experience, its feeling, like the felt sense we talk about, usually in the middle part of the body. When the body is processing that, what is it actually processing? It's processing a whole life situation. It's processing interactions in the world. So it's almost like that whole way of being a part of the larger system shifts.
Yes, yes, yes.
Sometimes that takes a long time to percolate up into understanding.
Yes, yes, yes. Yes. The body's not just a physical bag of muscles and bones. It's
Exactly.
beyond. It's interconnected. And then just one last question, Greg, which is the question about how do you see the discernment between spirituality and focusing oriented therapy in terms of a person's development and how they relate to each other or differ from each other?
Very interesting question. I think a lot of forms of therapy are about strengthening the person's identity. And I think that can be very helpful for people that are quite fragmented and really need to get a stronger sense of themselves. I think that focusing, I'm an existential psychotherapist, so I understand focusing in a particular way. And I would say that focusing is a phenomenological practice. So if you want to ask yourself about words like the self, spirituality, you need to go right into your experience and ask yourself, well, what does that word mean to me? If you ask, for me, if I ask into myself, what is this? What do I mean by self? Right in this moment. And I bring the question down into my body, it becomes a very open question. Like, what is this? If there is such a thing as the self, I am being one right now. So what is it? It's a very difficult question to answer. I think focusing is like that. It will take you right from the concrete experience in the present to who knows where. We don't know where focusing takes us. And I think for that reason, it does blend into something that has spiritual aspects to it. For me, I would say that focusing, it brings the location of the I. I think for many of us, we ride around in the world up here, right behind the eyes. That's where the I is. That's where I am. Um, I think the more you do focusing or something like it, the more that sense of I drifts down into the body and it becomes more expansive. It becomes more open. It becomes more inclusive of all different aspects of oneself. You find yourself surprised by yourself because you don't have such a set idea of what you are. And I think that opens the gateway to
Hmm.
questions about what is it to be me. So I think focusing brings you to a very open system, and not all forms of therapy do that.
It feels like the more we work experientially with the body, the more our identification from just the mentation of ourselves moves more into the experiential, which encompasses the whole of the body and beyond that we were talking about.
For me, at least, I don't have such a clear sense of who I am all the time. I have a grounded sense of my being because I'm in my body. But I can be easily surprised. It's like, oh, I didn't know that I liked that. Or I'm surprised that makes me nervous. I can be, I can
Uh-huh.
have the space to have more of my experience as a part of who I am.
It's almost like you have more of a witness consciousness. Can I call it that?
Exactly. It's exactly that. Yeah.
Yes, yes, that open spaciousness in which everything unfolds in. Well, thank you so much for this. This is wonderful. Yeah, so appreciate having you here.
It's been a pleasure. Yeah. Lovely to talk to you.
Yes, yes.